Continuing on with this file, we'll explore the various steps for creating new planes as well as new levels for this part. If I go down to the Levels Manager here, you'll notice that there's one level selected. Now, levels are ways to organize your geometry. If a geometry is on a specific level, you can turn that level on or off, effectively hiding or showing that geometry. You're not deleting it, you're just making it easier to organize your geometry into various groups. There's various ways of creating levels in Mastercam. I'll start by going down to the number and typing in the new number for a level that I want to create, in this case 10. I can either hit Enter or Tab, and that level is created, but notice there's no name here. I can either type in the name here, or I could go right up to the level list here, double click, and type in the level name here. This name will be Bounding Box. The reason we're calling it Bounding Box is because we're going to use the Bounding Box tool to create geometry, and it'll go on this level. Now with this level created, you'll notice there's 0 entities on it, which makes sense because we just created it. However, you'll also notice that there's a check mark next to it, which means this is the active level. In other words, anytime I create new geometry, it's going on this level. Now just be cautious, we have some settings up here. And one of the options is display options. And as you can see here, the first option is active level is always visible. I try to keep this on because if this is off, you can have a level that's active, meaning that's where the geometry is being created. However, you can also have it turned off so you don't see it. And what happens is when you create geometry, as soon as you are done creating that geometry automatically disappears because it gets put onto the active level, but that active level is hidden. So in other words, until you get more comfortable with Mastercam, I encourage you to keep this check marked. So since level 10 is the active level, let's go right into a wireframe tab, and we're going to create geometry called a bounding box. So when the bounding box utility comes up, you'll notice that it's presenting me to select one or more entities. I'm going to select this solid geometry, which will put a rectangle around this geometry. And I'm going to hit End Selection. And as you can see, we get a preview of what we're looking at here. The only other thing I'm going to select here is I want to make sure that lines and arcs and corner points are created. So this isn't creating solid geometry. It's basically just creating the outside rectangular shape of this part. And it's also putting a point at each corner. I'm going to click OK. And as you can see, we now have our geometry here. And specifically, it's on level 10, which is the active level. Again, it's called Bounding Box. We now have 20 entities on this level. Now that we have geometry that represents the outside of our part, we can use that geometry to put a new plane on this part. Because as we discovered earlier, this part is not connected to this origin. And as mentioned, we can do one of two things. We can move the part to the origin, or we can create a new plane. So let's create a new plane here. But before we do that, let's utilize the Viewsheets feature inside of Mastercam. That may or may not be turned on depending on your settings. Now if you go to the View menu, you'll see we have a group over here called Viewsheets, and I'm going to turn it on. So now it's pushed on. And as you can see down here, right below my gnomon, we have Viewsheet 1. This is important for the next step because we're going to be creating planes, and while you create planes, you have the automatic option of creating Viewsheets as well. So at this point, let's go and create a new plane by clicking on the Planes tab. And then under Planes, we see we have a plus here, and we have a variety of options for various methods for creating planes. I'm going to use Dynamic. And what Dynamic lets me do is snap my geometry, or in this case my gnomon, somewhere on my geometry to lock that plane in place. And even before I locate this plane, I can go up to the Name section and create a new name for this plane. So this plane will be called Op1. And this is to signify the first operation or the first setup for this part. And while we're here on the Advanced tab, you'll notice that we have the ability to create Viewsheet and save bookmark, and these are turned on by default. So we'll keep these here, and we'll investigate what happens when we're done creating the plane. And before I exit this section, you'll notice that we can change the color of the plane. This is very useful if you have multiple planes all around your part, and sometimes it's easier to color coordinate them or to make them a specific color so you can recognize them. Let's now place the gnomon, and I'm just going to go right up here and snap it right to this far corner. Now that's where the origin will be set up. And now since the gnomon is placed, we can position it in the proper orientation. So I'm going to rotate this gnomon so the Z is pointing up. And I can do that by using these arcs here. And by clicking once, I can then drag this around. And notice how it snaps to specific increments, in this case 180. Whenever you see a blue field like this, you can also type in the actual value you want, and it'll snap to that. So I'm going to click again to place that. So now the Z is pointing up. And now let's rotate this 90 degrees this way. And what you can also do is snap to actual geometry. So we know that this is 270, but let's say it wasn't. Let's say you wanted to snap to here. You could do that as well. We'll snap to 270. So X is going along the part, Y is going that way, and Z is pointing up. So this should be the final position of this gnomon, which will represent our new WCS for this part. And since we're done, and we already have it named, we can click the checkbox. So what happens is that new plane gets created, but you'll notice down here, we also have a new view sheet. That view sheet is the same name as the plane, and it was created when we created the plane. And depending on the settings when you create the plane, your new plane might be set up as the WCS and or the construction plane and the tool plane. In this case, they're not based on my settings. And those settings can be seen if we go back in to the dynamic plane creation, right down here, set as. I could have set that as my WCS and my T and my C plane. Let me just cancel out of this. And if we did that, they would be set here. We could always just set them this way by clicking. And now notice the WCS, C, and T planes are set to Op1. Now I'd like to set up my view sheet down here to display the proper planes and the proper geometry for this operation. So I'm going to go to my Levels Manager, and I'm going to hide the bounding box level. Now remember, I can't do that right now because this level is the active level. So if I change level 1 to be the active level, then I can select the X here to turn off bounding box, and you'll notice the bounding box geometry is now gone. I can also right click and go to isometric. So now this is the isometric view based on my Op1 plane. And if we go to the planes, you'll see that Op1 is selected. So I have my levels off. My Op1 is the active WCS with my C and T plane. And at this point, I can now right click on my view sheet and say Save View Sheet Bookmark. So what that did was that saved the orientation of my model, as well as which levels are on and off, and which plane is the active plane, all with this view sheet. And to prove it, if I go back to View Sheet 1 by simply clicking on it, positioning it in any way I want, setting any plane to be the active plane, if I go back and I click on Operation 1, the orientation updates, the plane updates, and whatever levels were on or off automatically get reset, and that bounding box is off and level 1 is on. So in summary, view sheets are a powerful way to create various layouts of your parts, including the orientation of the part on the screen, which levels are turned on and off, as well as which plane is active in your WCS. In the next lesson, we'll explore additional ways to create levels for your geometry and explore some of the options within the Level Manager in a little more detail.